Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our first Better Birding webinar of 2021. Good evening, Dave.
How's it, Mike? Good to be back.
Yeah, it is good to be back. I think we've reached a point where people forgot that we existed, which is probably a good thing in some respects, but it's good to be back. Yeah, and I think maybe just to start off by saying that we haven't disappeared. I think we were in a state of content overload towards the end of 2020 with all the Zoom meetings and everything that was going on. And I think our lives kind of took over as well. I also spent a fair amount of my day in front of a screen, and I felt it was good to take a bit of a break, but we're back. We have no fixed schedule of what we plan in the future, but we decided to run this webinar with our guest because it's a particularly topical one. So we hope that you all enjoy it. We seem to have an extremely full Zoom room. We're almost at 100 participants, and that's fantastic. We're streaming it live on Facebook as well, and we look forward to sharing some interesting insights into this relatively niche topic, but I think it should be fun.
100%, Mike. It's yeah, I can only echo what you were saying. It's fantastic to be back. I think we've both been very busy, not just with webinars, but with life and work and family and other pursuits.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe just before we get into the topic, I think it'll be quite interesting maybe just to find out what we've been up to. So Dave, and maybe specifically birding related, what have you been up to birding wise? Have you been seeing any lifers? Have you been out there at all? What's been keeping you busy from a birding perspective?
I guess last year I participated in the Cape Town 150 Challenge.
As did I.
Yeah, and so I was birding pretty hard last year. So actually in Jan, I took my foot off the gas a bit, and the work's been really busy, so that's been occupying a lot of my time. And I've actually just been enjoying birds like Crested Honey Buzzards and unfortunately dipping on white-throated bee-eaters in Cormacky. But
that's true.
Yeah, so I've just been sort of twitching birds here or there and birding my local patch at Kirstenbosch.
Yeah, I think I was going to ask you what your latest lifer was. I assume the Crested Honey Buzzards was it. I think that qualifies for me. I have had a relatively shambolic Crested Honey Buzzard experience. I know you saw it on the very first afternoon it was reported. It took me, I think, my fourth visit before I actually got a view of it. And I think when I saw it, it was probably 3 or 4 kilometers away. Then I went back and my second view was probably 2 or 3 kilometers away. And on my most recent visit, which was last week before the fires, I got a slightly better view. So that's good. I see that the sound is not great. I'm a little bit closer to the microphone now, so hopefully that will improve. All right, and then yeah, I think I've participated in the challenge. That was good fun, and we had some good fun on the weekend with some virtual courses, which are always great birds to see. But I think that's good enough for a catch-up. I think before we move on to our guest, let me just tell you about what we're going to do this evening. This will be a slightly more interactive webinar than the ones that we have run in the past. As I said to Dr. Callan Cohen about 15 minutes ago, as I said, that he's given us a lot of prep with his presentation. He sent it to us about 20 minutes ago. So we're going to all be surprised at what he's going to present. But we're really looking forward to it. So the way we'll work it is I'm going to move to the control panel. Dave and Carl are going to discuss the ID features and hybridization and all the topics of this evening. If you would like to ask questions during the evening, you can either just let me know that you want to ask a question live, or you can pop a question into the chat room and let's see how we go. I think it can get a little cluttered if we unmuting and muting. But I think if there are questions that are topical during the session, I'll take them over and I'll ask Dave and Carl to respond to those. Otherwise, we'll definitely leave some space at the end for a bunch of questions. So I'm going to move to the control panels, but maybe before I do that, I'd like to introduce our guests. So Dave, if you could just move on to the introduction slide for Carl. I think there's plenty of info there. I don't know why we've got a picture of him with a puff adder, but on the birding webinar, but it just shows Carl's got a huge interest in biodiversity. He's one of our most experienced birders in Southern Africa and actually happens to be one of the top birders in Africa. My first interaction with the name Callan Cohen was when I moved to Cape Town and I was looking to expand my life list just after my university days. Cal authored a book called Essential Birding to the Western half of Southern Africa. And I basically followed his guidelines in that book almost to the letter. And I would pick up lifers just about every weekend following his amazing details. I think I eventually met Cal a few years after that, and Dave Callan and I participated in a birding big day where we were doing a route around Swellendam. Cal couldn't make it the night before to stay over in Swellendam, so he picked me up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we went for 2.5 hours to Grootvadersbosch, and that day we hit just over 200 species, which in those days was good effort in the Western Cape. I don't think I identified too many of the birds. It was mostly Dave and Cal. Anyway, I've learned a lot since those days. Yeah, Cal is an extremely knowledgeable birder, and in this topic in particular, he's been quite instrumental in how this crested honey buzzard has been debated and identified. And I think Cal's going to go through some of those details, but he made the first interaction with the world expert Dick Forsman and debated it there in detail. And I think we have Cal to thank for a lot of the discovery that was made around this particular bird. So without me taking up any more time, what we're going to do is Dave and I are going to turn off our video, and we'd ask Cal to turn on his, and I'm just going to unmute Cal, and we will hear from him right now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Cal.
Okay, brilliant. Well, cool. Thanks for the intro. It's cool to be involved with these webinars. I've really enjoyed all the ones that I've watched. And yeah, it's kind of exciting with the discovery of this crested honey buzzard to get into some of these thoughts. I guess as most of you watching can know that like honey buzzard identification is extremely complicated. And when you throw in hybridization, you know, it gets even more complicated. And so I think the idea behind this webinar is just to look at some of the issues involved. In fact, even the identification of crested honey buzzards and their possible hybrid is like an emerging field of knowledge in birding, and we don't really know everything about it, and there's still going to be interesting discoveries to be made. And even the study of bird hybridization is sort of an emerging field. So there are lots of interesting questions and answers, and the idea is to sort of just get a bit of an intro as to some of the things, topical things that we can look for. So the idea behind this seminar is to be as interactive as possible, to get as many questions as possible, and to work with Dave and Mike as much as possible, and to look at these sort of this series of questions. So firstly, just like an introduction, like how important is hybridization in birds? It's obviously very topical at the moment. How would you recognize hybrids in birds? What are the ways we use? Do European and crested honey buzzards really hybridize? And I should just say at this point that we're using the word crested honey buzzard, but the bird goes by a number of other names, including oriental honey buzzard, that's often used. Then Dave's going to especially look in detail at the identification of European honey buzzard, EHB, and how to separate it from other raptors. And I'm going to take over again, looking at how to distinguish crested honey buzzard from European honey buzzard. I'll then look a little bit at how, once you've then got an introduction to both European and crested, we'll then have a little bit of a look at how you might look at recognizing a hybrid and speculate a bit about that. And then at the very end, we'll come back to the Somerset West bird and look carefully at the different features shown in the excellent photos of the bird and sort of discuss the question as to whether it's a hybrid or not. All right, so I think first is just a very brief introduction. Next slide.
Cal,
Yeah.
Cool. Let me just quickly mention that if people want to minimize the video on their screens, if they go to the top right of their screen, there should be some options there to change the view. So there's an option for, you could look at it in a matrix or a column or an individual video, or even there's a very thin line. And if you click that, that will remove all videos. So depending on how you want to view the presentation, you've got those options. Thanks, Carl. Go for it.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, and Dave, feel free to you know, chip in whenever something's a little bit unclear, or whether you have questions or thoughts. So, I mean, I guess standing at the Crested Honey Buzzard Twitch and chatting to people, searching for the bird and watching the bird, mainly searching for the bird, a lot of, you know, thoughts came up around hybridization and birds, and it made me realize that hybridization is a very topical thing at the moment for birders. It's something that I studied as part of my ornithology training through the FITS, and so it's something that for years I've had a special interest in, but seldom get to talk to birders around directly because it's not normally that topical. But at this point, especially with the Crested Honey Buzzard, it suddenly became quite a big deal, because I realized that hybridization as a concept makes birders quite nervous. Well, the first thing is that if a bird is a hybrid, then it can't be ticked. And a bird that can't be ticked doesn't really have a place on a list, and so it becomes slightly nebulous and slightly hard to understand. I think another, and so when birders go to a twitch, you know, there's a certain sense of accomplishment with seeing something concrete. And when something's a hybrid, it often doesn't feel concrete enough to people, and that sort of introduces a sense of uncertainty. I think birders also have a sort of a nervousness around hybridization, because there is an idea that if birds are found to hybridize, then they can no longer be different species, and they should be lumped as the same species. And I'll come to that in the next slide. So in some ways, life would be a lot easier if we just pretended hybrids didn't exist, because they are a little bit messy, really, and difficult to understand. But unfortunately, as the world changes, as climate changes and habitats are altered, hybridization between different species of birds is likely to become more and more common. And we're likely to start seeing more examples of hybrid birds. And that's why it felt like a good time to start thinking about some of the issues involved. And so here's just a very basic introduction. Dave, next slide. So firstly, hybridization is extremely common. So 16% of birds hybridize. That's a lot of the world's birds that hybridize. And so it's immediately apparent that, you know, not all times that birds hybridize does it lead to species level decisions. Some are complete freaks. So things like ibises and spoons. Sometimes an ibis will mate with a spoonbill, and you get something like in that picture, where the bird looks a little bit like one parent, or a bit of a mix between the two parents. And in most cases, these hybrids aren't necessarily fertile. They never breed again. And so it's a once-off. But what happens if the birds are a bit more closely related, and they are fertile? They produce young that can then breed again. And then those young will then go on to breed again and again. And what happens then is that you have a hybrid zone forming. And it tends to occur in a particular area. And it's normally where two different species meet. So if you look at that picture there in the bottom right, you can see there's two American warblers. The one found in the sort of more northern part of North America, and the other one found on the West Coast. And you can see that where the two meet, there's a narrow purple hybrid zone in between the two species. I don't know if you can see that on the picture. And that's a very typical pattern for hybridization. So we tend to have what are called sort of stable hybrid zones. You might think that if birds start to hybridize, that nothing would stop them, and that one species might eventually take over the whole of the other species. That is also a possibility, but we don't often see that in action. What we normally see is that birds hybridize, and they tend to form an equilibrium at the hybrid zone. And you might ask sort of, well, why would this happen? I mean, aren't these two things separate? Well, what can happen is birds could come together. Bird species might occur in different areas. They might be closely related, but for historical reasons or ecological reasons, they might be separated in different areas. And then as climate or habitat changes, they may then come together. Now, when they were far apart from each other, they would never hybridize, so it was never a problem. And then when they come together, just through chance, they just start to hybridize because they're still relatively closely related. this can also happen. An example are the greater and lesser spotted eagles in Europe. They're rather similar species, but just acknowledged as distinct species. And the greater spotted eagle sort of prefers, wooded habitats, and the lesser spotted eagle prefers sort of more open habitats and is found more to the east. But when humans start changing their habitat, when they start chopping down the forests and they create a more open habitat, among the more forest-dwelling greater spotted eagles range, then the birds start to hybridize. Another example of a hybrid zone in South Africa is in Namaqualand. Barlows and Karoo larks hybridize there in an extensive zone. And what happens is Barlow's lark is a very, very arid adapted lark. It likes often reddish sands. It's very closely related to dune lark. Some people have even suggested that it's the same as dune lark. And it occurs in the southern Namib and down to Port Nolloth. Whereas Karoo lark likes denser, thicker Karoo bushes and often paler gray soil. And where these two areas come together around Port Nolloth, where the sands mix and the vegetation mixes, the two birds mix. And they hybridize with each other at the exact point where the habitats meet. The birds will co-occur side by side and breed together. And then as you move further into the red dunes, you only get Barlow's larks. And as you move further away into the denser vegetation, you only get Karoo larks. And it seems that that hybrid zone is a very, very stable thing. It's just where the habitat's changing. It's just where the habitat's changing over. And those two birds otherwise for 500 kilometers in either direction behave as perfectly good species. But in that exact small little zone, they hybridize. And so taxonomists have thought a bit about this and have broadly said that if species do hybridize like this, it could indicate that they're different, that they are different species. And the biological species concept that most people are familiar with pretty much says just that species are animals that interbreed with each other, but not other species. So when you get interbreeding at a hybrid zone, it weakens the whole point of that argument. But people have realized that it happens so often that you can't just simply lump all bird species together, because 16% of bird species hybridize. So you have to make a judgment call as to whether the birds normally act as really good species, but only in a very small area of overlap are they then classed. If they only hybridize at a small area of overlap, you could then call them different species. So you could happily call greater and lesser spotted eagle different species. You could happily call Barlow's and Karoo lark different species. You would never otherwise confuse them. It gets a little bit more complicated when birds hybridize over a larger area. So with buzzards, actually, in Europe, the bird known as common buzzard of Western Europe meets the bird known as steppe buzzard from Eastern Europe. And they hybridize over quite a big area in Finland, and so those central northern parts of Europe. And taxonomists looking at this have decided, because the hybrid zone is so big and broad, and because there's so much variability in that zone, that it's better to lump common and steppe buzzards together as one species. So that's very much why we've had a bit of a name change in the bird that we used to call steppe buzzard, and that we now call common buzzard. We're still seeing the buzzards of the steppe, but it's decided, because of the hybridization with common, that they should all be lumped as the same species, and then the common buzzard. Dave, should we see what's on the next slide?
Sure. Carl, can I just ask you a quick question? So in terms of just thinking about why birds might hybridize, would it, so when two species, so if you look at, say, for example, a genus where you have species that are quite closely related to one another, would it be more common for species to potentially hybridize if they split into separate species quite recently versus species that perhaps separated a long time ago? Is it more common amongst or between species where maybe the split was more recent?
It's actually quite a complicated question to answer, but you don't
have to answer it, but maybe you can just ponder it while we...
I can try and answer it to sort of help you. Let's see if this is a useful explanation. So as species diverge, they become less likely to hybridize. So an ostrich wouldn't hybridize with a bunting because it's just they've diverged so much that they have so little in common. They just simply wouldn't be able to mate. At the other extreme, when birds are in the process of evolving into two species, initially they do hybridize as part of that process, and then they start to split into two separate species. Let's say that one of them likes forests and one of them likes grasslands, and they start to split, and the ones on the edge of the forest no longer breed with the ones in the grassland, and they start to become two different species in that case. Then let's also say there was another species that liked wetlands, and that one diverged to go into wetlands. Now, if the forest and the grassland species came, one was going in forest, the other one was going in grassland, and they started to become adapted to their separate habitats. If they hybridized, they would form a bird that was neither adapted to forest nor grassland. And if there's no such intermediate habitat, those young would die out because they really had no habitat that they were adapted to. And so it can create the situation where very closely related birds actually hybridize less because they know that, I'm talking very loosely now, but they sort of know that if they breed together, that their young won't be fit and will die out. So they tend to avoid each other. So sometimes very closely related species have developed reproductively isolating mechanisms to stop that happening. Whereas they could both probably go and breed with the wetland one that split off even earlier, because that hasn't been having those consequences and it might not have developed those, isolation mechanisms. Does that make sense?
Perfect, thanks.
Cool. So, without still trying to keep it fairly simple, like how would we as birders recognize hybrids? So, I mean, hybridization is something we're probably going to encounter more. And how do we go about recognizing it and thinking about it? Well, of course, some people will say, well, you have to use genetics to recognize hybrids. And it's true that genetic studies can be very conclusive in recognizing hybrids. I've done those studies myself, and it's amazing to see how birds, the DNA is mixed. You can also look, if you don't have access to a lab, you can also get some insights by looking at mixed pairs. You can actually go to a place and you might find a nest which has got, the one is an adult greater spotted eagle and the one's an adult lesser spotted eagle. And then that also gives you, some evidence. I mean, I guess this would be the case. I think there was a Rupel's vulture breeding with a Cape vulture in the Bloberg. You could see then that would be evidence of that chick being a hybrid without doing the genetics. But probably the most important pattern that ourselves as birders can use, and that's extremely important, it should never be downgraded in relation to genetics, is that we can look really carefully at the plumage patterns of birds. And this can be done with the eye, but now by taking really good resolution photos. And that can allow us to answer lots and lots of questions without doing the genetics. And the sort of, there is a key element though. And if we were to say, is something a hybrid, we would look, so let's look at the picture on the right. I got this off the internet. It's Labradors and poodles. It illustrates it very easily. So when if you look on the, I guess the right of that image, where you have a purebred Labrador breeding with a purebred poodle, you then get what people would call F1 Labradoodles, I guess, in this case. And let's say that was a greater and lesser spotted eagle, you get like a medium spotted eagle. And as birders, when we're out birding in the field and we spot a bird that looks a little bit unusual, we can take photos and look really carefully and try and decide if the unusual bird is essentially a 50-50 cross between two different parents. And that's something that we might be able to do. I mean, I've seen photos of where moorhens and coots have hybridized, and and various other birds, the Barlow's larks, where essentially you're looking at a 50-50 hybrid. And many people with a bit of experience with the parent species, can recognize that and show that with photographs. It gets more complicated though, when the purebred Labrador then breeds with the F1 Labradoodles in that case. And then if you look down a little bit below, the birds or dogs or whatever start to look a little bit more like the one species and the other species, and only look, you see, in this case, they've only got the black nose and the black ears of the purebred poodle, but they're mostly Labradors. And even in that case, you might think, well, it doesn't look quite right, but it's still definitely got a black ear of a poodle. It must be a hybrid poodle. But then if those ones had to then breed again with the purebred Labrador, they may even find that those ears go gray. And so then it becomes much, much harder to determine hybrids. So as sort of field birders, it's much more easy to identify F1 hybrids, the first generation of hybrids. But then when those hybrids start breeding back with the purebred Labradors in this example, it's called sort of back crossing. And at every generation, they get diluted. And you can have a situation where an animal or bird may look very much like the parent, but there's still a little bit of hybrid genes in there somewhere. And that's a situation we can discuss later. Another very important thing to consider if you are seeing an interesting bird and you're wondering if it's a hybrid is, where are you seeing this funny looking bird? And because if you were to argue that it's a hybrid, the chances are that the unusual bird would be in the zone of overlap between the two species. I've brought up the American warbler map below, again, just to show, you know, the birds that have mixed characters that one would see in the field would be in the orange, in the purple magenta zone in between the red and the blue. If you saw a strange looking bird, say in the middle of the blue in Alaska, that maybe had the black ears of a poodle, just to mix the examples a bit, you might think, is it more likely a hybrid, or maybe it's just natural variation? Because remember that all animals and birds are naturally a little bit variable. I mean, people are too. Everything's a little bit unique, and you know, that's how evolution works. It works on that variation in the population. Some people are taller, some people are shorter, and every population of birds, as you know, as birders, if you look at enough, and this is part of the natural variation. And one important way of distinguishing hybrids from natural variants is, firstly, does it have the characters of both parents that you suspect it does? And secondly, is it in the zone of overlap? Because if it's not in the zone of overlap, it's probably just natural variation. Cool, so that brings us, I think, to thinking a little bit about honey buzzards in the next slide. Do you have any thoughts there, Dave?
No, Cal, there had been a couple of questions, but we'll save those for the end. I think your hands might be touching your microphone, so maybe if you could just sit on those. We lose your voice every now and then. But I'll flip to the next slide. Thanks.
So this brings us to the honey buzzards, and we, Kate Morris found this crested honey buzzard a month or so ago, caused a lot of pandemonium among birders to go and see it and to try and understand it. And because crested honey buzzard is often implicated in hybridization, it immediately became a question mark over this bird. Well, is it a pure bird? Was it a hybrid? And lots of opinions really went around. Yes, it is. Yes, it isn't. And I guess this is a bit about trying to understand like what the evidence is for some of those opinions. And some suggested actually that European and crested honey buzzards don't even hybridize, that there's no evidence for it, and maybe it's not true. And maybe it's not true. So let's have a look at what some of the evidence is here. So firstly, to introduce the two species, European honey buzzard, which used to be called Western honey buzzard, or sometimes called Western honey buzzard, is in blue on the map. And crested honey buzzard is in red. Both are migrants, so you can see how European honey buzzard winters in tropical Africa down to Cape Town. And you can see how crested honey buzzard winters sort of in the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Now, the situation is slightly complicated in that they're also sort of resident races or species of crested honey buzzard. And in fact, some of those other species have been split off as different species, sort of in the Philippines. And we're not going to consider them further here. I mean, it's very interesting and it's worth looking up online at some of these amazing honey buzzards. But what we're primarily interested in are what are shown in this map as European honey buzzard in red, and the oriental subspecies of crested honey buzzard, European honey buzzard in blue, and the oriental subspecies of crested honey buzzard in red. It's why it's sometimes called oriental honey buzzard. And if you look there, their breeding ranges in the dark colors do overlap, or thought to overlap. That's in Siberia. It's not in an area very many people go to, and there's never been a proper study done in the breeding ground. So people have never actually seen mixed pairs on the nests together, and they've never sort of caught a bird and sequenced its DNA. So in some ways, it is actually unproven from that point of view whether or not crested and European honey buzzards interbreed. However, there seems to be, there's other ways of looking at it. And the other way of looking at it is to look very carefully at the plumage and structural features that these birds show. And then we also need to ask the question, if we see variation in crested honey buzzard, is this as a result of hybridization with European honey buzzard, or is this as a result of natural variation? And the same with European honey buzzard. And so what we really want to do to think about this is to look at, in the area of overlap, where do these birds show, these intermediate characteristics? And this map needs to be updated slightly because more and more crested honey buzzards have started wintering in the Middle East. In a number of countries in the Middle East, it's now a regular thing involving dozens or maybe hundreds of birds. And some of those are coming through into Africa now. It could be that this is just part of a natural change in the species, but other people have argued it's actually as a result of hybridization with European honey buzzard. And when they hybridize with European honey buzzard, their sort of migratory urge is then to migrate to Africa and not to Asia. And that's why we're starting to see these birds coming here now. But anyway, I think in order to think about this a bit better, we have to know firstly what European honey buzzard looks like, and then what crested honey buzzard looks like before we can start to think about what the hybrids might look like. So Dave, I think unless you have any questions about this, I think you were going to dive in with some European honey buzzard ID.
Sure, thanks, Cal. I must say I'm quite surprised at the small size of the potential hybrid zone, but I guess we can get into that a bit later.
Yes.
Right, so European honey buzzard is a bird that's quite close to my heart, and I think to yours too, Cal. I mean, we've been watching them around Cape Town for probably close to 30 years. John Graham was the first person to pick them up around Cape Town, I think the sort of mid 1980s, early 1980s, and at that time it was a very rare bird. It was rare in Southern Africa, but particularly rare around Cape Town. It had just never been recorded here, and so yeah, over the last sort of 25, 30 years, Callan and I spent a lot of time watching them, and have always been very sort of interested in them. And we definitely noticed that more recently they appear to have become a lot more common. But maybe before I get into that, so as Cal's mentioned, honey buzzard is a Palearctic migrant, so they breed in Europe and they migrate into Africa every sort of I guess European winter, so our summer. But I think what's interesting about them is, so they're called a European honey buzzard, but are they actually a buzzard? They're in a different genus, so they're not a buteo, they're a Pernus. And so Pernus epivorus is the European honey buzzard specific name, and epivorus apis referring to bee. And yeah, so they're very interesting because they don't also behave like buzzards. So we're used to driving down the N1 and seeing common buzzards perched on posts or soaring overhead. They're very obvious, whereas honey buzzards are actually really the opposite. They're quite shy, and they've adapted to sort of forest habitats in Europe where they breed. They spend a lot of time in quite mature forests, and the same here. So the adults when they winter in South Africa and also around Cape Town, they generally sort of stick to quite sort of forested habitats, and they spend a lot of time under the canopy on the ground, scratching around. Despite a Primaries apis referring to bee, their most common prey types actually wasps. So they spend a lot of time foraging, looking for wasps, and they do also feed on small vertebrates, sort of fairly opportunistic hunters. But their main source of nutrition is the wasp. So they're quite different to butios, and like I mentioned, so they definitely seem to have increased in number in the last sort of I'd say 10 or 15 years. And there are a few theories as to why this might be the case. And Caroline Howes, I guess now Dr. Caroline Howes, did a really interesting study, I think it was for her PhD, on this exact question. So why are European honey buzzards appear to be more regular in the region? Because if you look at particularly Palearctic, but I guess all long distance migrants, they seem to be under severe pressure. So not only where they're breeding, but also on passage. Honey buzzards, they move through the Mediterranean, often through bottlenecks, and there's a lot of hunting. So I think we lose a lot of birds to hunting in countries like Italy and Malta. So that's a big issue. So it's quite interesting. So the fact that I guess also with climate change, migrant birds are under pressure, but why then are European honey buzzards increasing in number in our region, or appearing to increase? So one of the theories is that are there just more bird watchers around? Are more people looking for birds? I think with things like South African Rare Bird Alert and Rare Bird News, where Trevor Hardacre publishes reports of these birds twice a week. I think people are just used to seeing photos of them, and I guess getting a bit better at identifying them. So maybe that's also a driver for increasing the record number. But anyway, so these are questions that I think Caroline attempted to answer, and she did sort of arrive at some very interesting conclusions. What I found most interesting actually about her study was I guess the breakdown of sex, but also age of the birds pitching up in SA. What was of particular interest were the fact that most of them are females. So this is referring to birds that are adults, because it's not possible to sex sub-adult birds, but adults you can sex. So if you see an adult honey buzzard, you can essentially just assume that it's most probably a female. There are records of males every summer. But you can see from this data, 6.7%. So that's 19 birds in 15 years. So if you see a male European honey buzzard, you count yourself pretty lucky. They really aren't common. So the other interesting split was the number of adults to sub-adults. So adults, almost 60%, and juveniles in second years, a bit less. So what's interesting is that the adults obviously with experience, they've learned the quickest way to get to Africa. So they find that when they migrate through the Mediterranean, they focus on bottlenecks. So they want to limit the amount of time they're flying over water. So they'll choose land gaps that are quite small, whereas the younger birds are less experienced and tend to spend a lot more time flying over water. So they take a bit longer. They also leave a bit later than the adults. They leave the breeding grounds. And then also what tends to happen, that the adults really make a beeline for an area where they know. So they find that the adult honey buzzards are very, they always tend to return to the same site every year. So they've obviously sussed out where good habitat is, and they'll come back every year to the same spot. Whereas because the young birds don't have that experience, they tend to wander and be more susceptible to the elements. So they tend to get pushed around by weather systems, and so the adults will sort of move directly south to where they want to winter, whereas the young birds will tend to wander around a bit. They'll move into West Africa and then sort of cross over to East Africa and then sort of work their way down south and spend a lot of time, I guess, figuring out where they want to spend the northern winter. I've included just a breakdown of how to age a honey buzzard. So it takes 3 years for a young bird to reach adult plumage. What's interesting is that so once a bird has fledged, in its first year, it's referred to as a juvenile, and then it's in its second year, it would be year 2, and then in year 3, it would mature to an adult. And what's nice about honey buzzards is that their plumages are distinct at each of these phases. And what research has shown is that the young birds tend to spend those first 2 years in Africa. So if you look in European field guides or speak to European birders or authorities on honey buzzards, they actually know very little about the plumage characters of these young birds. So we're actually in a great position because we're seeing these birds, and we can learn a lot about them and what they look like and what they're doing. So yeah, just quickly on the fact that there are a lot more females here. One hypothesis is that what's called the arrival time hypothesis is that the studies looking at the migratory bottlenecks in the Mediterranean show that the sex split is 50-50, but looking at Southern Africa, it's obviously got a very different balance. It's very skewed. And the theory there is that the males want to remain quite close to their breeding grounds because they don't want to miss out on, they don't want to arrive back in Britain and find another male in their forest, particularly because they are so loyal to specific sites. So the theory is that they don't travel as far south because they don't want to risk getting back late and losing out on good breeding habitat. The next few slides, I'm just going to run through some of the identification characters. But before I do that, I'm just going to chat a bit about how you separate a honey buzzard from a common buzzard or just a buteo. So honey buzzards they're quite different in terms of their structure. So they're typically longer winged. When you see them in the field, you'll notice immediately that they have quite a floppy flight. If they're gliding, they tend to, gliding or soaring, they tend to fly on very flat wings. So you'll find that a common buzzard or even a jackal will have, you'll notice that their wingtips sort of point upwards at the end, the primary fingers will stick up, whereas a honey buzzard will have very, very flat wings or even downturned wings. Another very obvious feature is the head. It's quite small. It's very sort of pigeon-like. It's also got a very long tail. So the general impression of shape and size is a very long-winged, sort of floppy-winged, long sort of narrow tail, and a small pigeon-shaped head. And then to get, I guess, a bit more specific, they have very sort of obvious barring on the flight feathers, so on the secondaries and the primaries. You can see on this bird on the right, it's got quite strong lines or barring across those flight feathers. It's hard to see on this bird on the right, the honey buzzard. It's because it's a dark bird, but they also have dark carpal patches, so that's quite an important point to remember when thinking about buzzards in general, but particularly European honey buzzards. You want to focus on that area. So when I say carpal, it's that point of the wing. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it's really sort of at the curve of the wing, or the elbow between the arm and the hand. So the arm being the secondaries, and the hand being the primaries. What's also very obvious in adult birds is that they have golden eyes, very bright eyes, whereas in common buzzard and other buzzards, young birds tend to have lighter eyes, and as they age, their eyes get darker. So that's really striking in adult birds, like you can see on this individual. When looking at younger birds or sub-adult birds, I mentioned you get juveniles, which are in their first year, and then you get second-year birds. The most obvious feature, which I always notice, are the dark secondaries. So you'll see this bird on the left, it's got very, very dark secondaries. You don't typically see that in other buzzards. It's also generally got 3 bars. So I mentioned that barring in the wing. You can see that this bird has got three bars in the sort of secondary area. And again, you can see that pigeon head and that tail. The tail in young birds can look a bit shorter than the adults, and that's often because they're often in quite fresh plumage, so they haven't molted yet, and their secondary feathers can be a bit longer, which will make the tail look a bit shorter. Other features to look at which are really useful are the black bill and the yellow cere. That's quite obvious. And then as the bird ages, the cere actually turns grey. So in the adults, you'll see a bright golden eye, and a dark cere and a dark bill. And then in young birds, obviously a dark eye. And then another feature are the all dark primary tips. So those are the young birds. So it can be quite tricky to tell a juvenile bird from a second year bird. Second year birds, if you look at our young birds in our region, certainly in my experience, a lot of them seem to be first year birds, juveniles, and you don't often see second year birds. And the best way to tell those apart is that you'll start to see adult feathers sort of molting through. So you'll see in the flight feathers, you'll see evidence of adult feathers. And there won't be as, because if you think about it, if a bird fledged in say August last year, we're now in March, a first year bird will be in pretty good condition, and the feathers will be nice and neat. If you look at this bird on the right, you'll see there's very little evidence of wear in the flight feathers, whereas a bird that's at least a year old will be a lot more wear. There'll be missing feathers. Birds' feathers get sort of quite weather beaten, so it's quite obvious when a bird's sort of very neat that's typically a very sort of fresh bird or young bird. Right, I'll just quickly run through some of the characters of how to tell males from females. This is an obvious adult, like I mentioned. It's got a bright golden eye. What's obvious about males is that they have this gray head, which is really distinctive. It stands out against that golden eye. Like I mentioned, it's got a dark carpal patch. The males have this big gap between this trailing edge. So the back of the wing has got this sort of dark area, then it's got a big gap, and then you can only really see one or two bars in the flight feathers, whereas in a female, you'll see many more bars. That pattern of that wide gap is then also repeated in the tail. So you'll see the tail feathers have a big gap between that, the bar at the base of the tail and then those subterminal bars. That's what makes males really obvious. So if you see a male in the region, it should really stand out, an adult male. Females are less striking, so they haven't got that gray head. They've got the golden eye, but they don't have the gray head. They've got a brown head. And like I said, they've got this narrow gap. So if you look at that dark trailing edge at the back of the wing, it's a very small gap between, particularly in the secondaries, between that trailing bar and the bars in the actual flight feathers. So you should see the young birds have at least 3 bars. This bird's got sort of one bar showing. And then what typically happens is that that same pattern in the flight feathers is then repeated in the tail feathers. So there won't be as big a gap between the bar at the base of the tail and the subterminal bars. I've just thrown in a couple of slides to test ourselves. This is a bit of practice. So this is let's hope I get them right. So this is a photo that Mike Buckham took, I think on the weekend actually. The bird he saw at Cecilia Forest. So the first thing that stands out for me are the dark secondaries. And you can see that yellow cere, which immediately says it's a young bird. If you look at the plumage, it's in pretty good condition, not a lot of wear. You can't see any adult sort of feathers coming through. So I'd say this is a first year bird. It probably fledged last year. So it's within its first year of life. It would be a classic juvenile. This is a beautiful photo. It's very clearly an adult bird. It's got that golden eye. It hasn't got the gray head of a male, so this is a female. You can also see the barring in the wing, so it hasn't got a big gap between that trailing bar and the flight feather bars, and that's repeated in the tail. That's a lovely female. This bird on the left was taken from Trevor Hardaker's Rare Bird Report, taken by Tanya, actually quite recently. This photo was also posted on Facebook. This is in fact a male, which is quite unusual, photographed in KZN. So again, you can see that gray head, that golden eye, and you can see that big gap between the barring and the flight feathers and the trailing edge, and again repeated in the tail. So that's a lovely male, and you can see it's molting. So these birds also do what they call sort of step molt. So they'll molt a bit when they're breeding, and then when they migrate, they'll actually stop molting. And when they get to their wintering grounds, you'll see they'll then continue molting. So you'll see flight feathers of different ages because they pause their molting while they're migrating. The bird on the right was taken at Rietvlei by Jean van Rooyen. That I'd say is probably a transitional bird. It's in quite dark secondaries. You can see a bit of a yellow cere. I'd say it's probably a young bird. Carl, I don't know if you agree, but it if it's an adult, it's hard to see it might have a golden eye actually. Could be a female. Don't know what you think, Carl.
When was that bird taken now, in the last month or two?
Yeah.
I think it must be an adult female, because if it was a second year bird, I think we would see, at this time of year, I think it would be mostly finished, so it would be in third. I think we'd only recognize these second year birds getting adult plumage towards the end of the year when they're in active molt. I think I've got that right. Yeah, because they would start their molt in spring probably, and so we should see a bit more mixing of the feathers there. So I think the fact that it's got all female feathers suggests it's a third year, at least it's an adult.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't quite see the sear. I can't see if that's if it's yellow or if it's just being blown out a bit.
Yeah, it's probably hard to see. Also, that I guess the barring in the secondaries, they're not many bars, so it would indicate an adult. Just those dark secondaries can be a bit misleading.
Yeah.
Cool. Then this bird on the left is another cracking adult male in Sasselberg. So again, the gray head, and you can see that big gap between that bar at the end and the subterminal bar on the tail. It's a lovely adult bird. And then this bird on the right you can see the classic honey buzzard, small head, long tail. This has started molting. This I would say it's a sub-adult. It appears to be showing a few, it's in molt. It's probably, might be entering its second year. Again, open for debate.
I guess I'd say that one way of recognizing the adult feathers is that the adult feathers often have quite a strong trailing edge on the secondaries, when a single feather comes through with just the black trailing edge, it stands out very strongly against the remaining juvenile feathers. So if we look at that bird, none of those have that dark, they stand out like little squares. As they start to grow their feathers through, they stand out like squares. That's a good way of picking it out.
I guess the light's playing a bit of a trick on those, on the top wing.
Yeah, I think that feather's slightly out of place. I think.
Okay, let's not get too technical. And then, yeah, the bird on the left, I'd say is also a young bird. And then the bird on the right was submitted by Roz Lindley. She emailed it to us. And I think that's an adult female, just based on the spacing on the tail. Great. So that concludes the European honey buzzard section. Carl, do you want to move on to Crested Honey Buzzard?
Yeah, so I'm going to very much build on what you said, and feel free to interrupt. I'm even going to steal some of your photos. So before I go into the flight photos, so something to mention is these birds are they're much easier to identify in flight. But I wanted to show you a photo of one sitting, because even though these birds are quite closely related to each other, there are some important structural differences that are more easily seen in a perched bird. And in particular, this photograph from eBird caught my eye, because you can see how much bigger the feet and claws are than European honey buzzard. I don't know if you can see on this photo, they're actually quite monstrous. And it's a very big difference between the species, one that you can seldom see in flight. Sometimes you can see the long toes and claws sticking out over the sort of undertail covered feathers. But it just shows it really nicely in this photo. The bill is also a little bit heavier than in European honey buzzard, but it's still relatively light for a raptor. But yes, so if you can maybe move on to the next photo, Dave. This is a very interesting photo of a crested honey buzzard, because it shows the general impression that one gets is actually can be very different to a honey buzzard. It's often said that the bird looks much more eagle-like, and that's certainly the case for this bird. You see how it looks much more at a glance like a distant tawny eagle or something like that, or a different type of eagle. not necessarily creating that sort of very long-winged feel of the European honey buzzard. And it can be a very important character for spotting the birds at a distance, and also for evaluating them. But it's also difficult with experience because males and females and juveniles all have slightly different shapes depending on the relative length of their tail and their molt. And so I thought I would try focus more on the characters that you can see more clearly. So Dave, I don't know if you could go on to the next shot. Cool, thanks. So what I've done is I've used exactly the same photos that Dave's used to show you how to identify European honey buzzards. And I've compared it with a crested or oriental honey buzzard, that's the same species, on the right. And I've tried to use arrows to show how things differ. Sometimes the arrows get a little bit messy, but I think it's still useful to have them. And moving from top to bottom, so if you, let's say, if you were in the field, I mean, certainly one way of looking for these birds is that very much heavier jizz of the crested honey buzzard. But if you were looking at a photo, often things happen very quickly. If you're looking at a photo or trying to evaluate something that you could see with more leisure, one of the most obvious differences, and it's a structural difference that creates a different shape in the wing, is that European honey buzzards have 5 fingers in their hand, whereas crested honey buzzards have got 6. So I don't know, Dave's sort of counting them out in European honey buzzard. And then if you see in crested honey buzzard, there are always 6 fingers. And that unfortunately is not the very best picture because one of the fingers is a bit hidden. But we'll look at that in the other pictures too. So that's what we mean with, you know, the 5 versus the 6 fingers. Another feature that's a little bit subtle, but happens to be the second arrow down, so I'm going to point it out, is that both European and crested honey buzzards in their flight feathers and coverts have these beautiful stripes that essentially extend from the body to the outer edge of the wing. And it's one of the things that makes these birds so striking and beautiful, are these sort of barred approach. And if you look at the European honey buzzard on the left, you'll see that those bars on the underneath of the male's primary feathers, his hand, are nice and neat. Dave's got a nice sort of smooth mouse action. Whereas if you look on crested honey buzzard, they often seem as if they all grew at the wrong stages and different lengths, and they're often out of sync with each other. This is actually an example of a relatively neat looking crested honey buzzard, but you'll see in some of the others, sometimes they look as if the bands are all muddled up. And that can be a good feature if you're, for instance, looking at a photo. Then probably another critical feature that doesn't always show, but when it does, is absolutely critical and striking and almost immediately noticeable, is that crested honey buzzards do not have the carpal patch of European honey buzzards. A lot of the feel of a European honey buzzard is created by that black oval carpal patch sort of under the wrist, whereas in crested honey buzzard never has it. Then I've also got the next arrow down is contrasting these males again, and it's actually pointing out 2 features that are side by side. The one feature is the eye color. As Dave mentioned, European honey buzzard has a staring yellow eye as an adult, whereas male crested honey buzzard has got a deep ruby red eye that appears mostly dark. And you can see how it appears dark in this photo. The females actually have pale eyes, but not the males. And you can also see just below that eye that crested honey buzzard has a sort of like a pale throat with a dark gorget around. That's not in all birds, but it's in most birds. And you never really get the same impression on European honey buzzard. You get a bit of a paler throat, but you don't generally get that very dark bordering gorget. And that's another feature that stands out, you know, quite prominently. Then the tail is also has 2 important differences. Firstly, the male crested honey buzzard on the right has got an extremely boldly barred tail. It's actually only essentially got 2 giant black bars. It can have a 3rd bar at the base of the tail where it meets the body, but it has 2 very thick black bars, thicker than European honey buzzard, and they're separated by a very bold white bar. So if you see them from above, it's extremely characteristic, you know, almost Western banded snake eagle-like, but not quite. You know, it's much more bold than a European honey buzzard. So in some ways, the male crested honey buzzard is a very, very distinctive bird. And I've actually put the next slide I've compared the, oh, I think we might have gone through 2 slides very quickly, Dave. So you can go, if you can go back another one. Yeah, we skipped over the slide, but basically this is just exactly the same thing to illustrate that. Again, using the European honey buzzard in the blue sky, comparing it to the crested honey buzzard, you can see counting the primary, the hand, the feathers of the hand. The crested clearly has 6 feathers in that photo. You can see they're showing a bit of wear. You can see how the feathers are a bit frayed at the end. That's just the process of feather wear. Moving down, you can see that the European honey buzzard has the dark black carpal mark under the wrist, which is completely absent in the crested honey buzzard. Again, the dark eye, and you can see the throat gorget of the crested. These are absent in European. Again, the tail pattern, look how broadly marked that male crested honey buzzard's tail is, especially that bar which goes past the feet. It's extremely broad, it's unmistakable. Another thing to notice that I didn't mention on the last picture is that crested honey buzzard has a distinctly shorter tail. And if you imagine, if you look, the tail is basically a little bit less wide than the wing, whereas in European honey buzzards, it's normally distinctly longer than the base of the wing, the tail. You can see it in this photo quite clearly, but it can be hard to judge because it very much depends on the angle of the bird. But with a few photos and with a bit of experience, it can be useful character. And then I've also tried to show there on the very bottom how the extreme neatness on those underwing bars of that male European honey buzzard, whereas the crested honey buzzard, it looks like all the feathers have grown at different speeds and the black bars are all jumbled up. Cool. Can you maybe go through 2? So that's a male again, and now we're on to the female. Sorry, this is chaos with the arrows, but let's see if it works. So again, we've got the situation where with the 5 fingers, European honey buzzard always has 5 fingers, and crested honey buzzard always has 6 fingers. Very distinct. Female honey buzzards are similar in a way. So just like the male is very much more broadly, boldly marked underneath, it's the same in crested honey buzzard. The female is more similar to the juvenile and less boldly marked underneath, and often a little bit difficult to tell from the juvenile, just like with Europeans. You can see in this picture on the left that European honey buzzard has a dark carpal patch. So now we need to look and see if it's on the crested. But if you look on the crested, it's actually, we can't tell, because on dark birds, and a certain percentage of them are dark birds, you just can't tell if there's a dark patch there or not. A European, European will show the patch, but if it's an all dark bird, and crested may be hiding its patch in that way. The next arrow down is, we're just going to look at the face. You can't see it extremely well on this photo, but you can see that the crested honey buzzard on the right has actually got a yellow eye, and that the male in the previous shot had a dark red, ruby red eye. And you can actually see that there's a contrasting white throat with the dark gorget there. It's not so clear, but it's clearly visible. And you can sort of see it's not on that European, but the angle's not perfect. And then again, I'm just trying to show with the awkward arrow that goes sort of crossing other arrows, that the female European has got more neatly, more aligned bars under the wing, whereas the crested bars all look like they've shifted in relation to each other. And again, you can see that these are both female honey buzzards, because remember the males have got their barring, they have got a big pale area on their secondaries and their wing, and all the bars are much closer to their arm, whereas these have got the bars more evenly spread along the wing. Cool, should we look at the next photo? Here's a juvenile. Again, I've taken the juvenile that Dave showed you and compared it to a crested honey buzzard juvenile. Again, the number of fingers is distinctive, even in the juvenile. Juveniles have these extremely densely barred wings, very African harrier hawk-like, with lots of thin bars, and even look a bit like a black sparrowhawk with lots of these very thin, bold bars next to each other, quite strong. And you can see, so the first arrow shows the 5 fingers versus 6 fingers. The second arrow shows that even juvenile honey buzzards, European honey buzzards can show a carpal mark, whereas in juvenile crested honey buzzard, there's no carpal mark. Look at that, absolutely unmarked. The next arrow down is showing the secondary barring. There's a few characters here that are interesting. You can actually see just at a glance that the crested's got lots of thin little bars there. And you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars, I think. Whereas if you look at European honey buzzards, you can only really see 2 or 3 bars there. So it's distinctly fewer bars, generally about 3 bars in European and 4 or 5 or 6 in crested. You can also see that the crested honey buzzard, that the juvenile European honey buzzard shows a bolder bottom bar. The trailing bar is a bit thicker, whereas on crested honey buzzard, the trailing bar is no thicker than any of the other bars. That's quite an important difference. The tails of crested honey buzzards, just like with European honey buzzards, are hard to determine. Adult honey buzzards, males and females, show distinctive tail patterns, very bold, whereas juvenile honey buzzards show often much sort of watered down versions of the adults, and it's often a little bit difficult to tell for sure what the characters are. There's no published references that allow one to sex honey buzzards on their juvenile tails. But more about that later. Dave, can we look at the next pic? Here's another example of a juvenile. It's a bit more ragged, but again, it shows those firstly, it's got all 6 fingers. It doesn't have a dark carpal mark. It's got lots of little lines under the secondaries, under its arms. Like under its sort of wing feather arms. Lots of little white lines. There's no big broad one on the bottom. The tail is very diffusely marked. And the primaries themselves, the fingers themselves are generally all very, very black. If you think back to some of these pictures of male honey buzzards, they've got these beautiful black tips contrasting with white inner parts. In juveniles, it's just very dusky. Again, you can also see the throat gorget. And you can also see on this bird that this is quite of a chunky bird. It doesn't have the elegance of a European honey buzzard. It's a bit broader winged. It's a bit bigger headed, maybe. The tail isn't super long, although it's a little bit differently shaped in juveniles. Cool. Should we move on to the next slide? So crested honey buzzard, as we used to know it, or Oriental honey buzzard, crested honey buzzard, used to winter in Southeast Asia and India, and European honey buzzard in Africa. But more and more, there's an appreciation of birds wintering in the Middle East, and a few now coming through into Africa. These are 2 African records. The one on the left is a crested honey buzzard. There are very few confirmed records for Africa. I can't remember exactly how many, but probably 5 or so. Very, very few records. The first one was from Gabon. There's been one in East Africa. I think this one for Tertius was the first or second for East Africa. And you can again see the crested honey buzzard features. So the 6 primaries, you can see if you look down, there's no carpal patch. You could see when you look at the bird, it's got a gray face. The eye is quite dark. And it's got the white throat and it's got the black gorget. It's also this very pale cinnamon sandy color. And that is a phase you don't really get actually in European honey buzzards. And it's quite common in crested honey buzzard. So even without getting too technical, if the bird is this color, then already you should be thinking, oh, this must be a crested. And then you can look at the other features to check up on that. You can also see the nice big broad bar in the tail. A very nice bird. Then this bird on the right, very recently, this bird was photographed in Kenya a few days after the Somerset West bird was discovered. Again, if you look, first things first, number of primaries, look, it's got number of fingers in the hand, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can also see, well, firstly, the carpal can't be used on this bird because it's a dark bird. So the carpal feature is of no use. Then you could look at the tail and look at that extremely bold tail pattern. European honey buzzard will never show such a bold tail pattern. And again, what Dave was actually trying to point out even just before I showed you that was that if you look at the I guess that with the bars as they come from the underwing to the primaries, how jumbled up they all are. You know, remember European honey buzzard has a nice neat pattern at that point. And then whereas this bird has a much more jumbled up, you know, approach. And I mean, looking at this bird, sorry, if you can go maybe back to that bird, you know, this is a bird that, you know, shows these, you know, relatively classic crested honey buzzard patterns. But then you could also look at a bird like this and say, you know, it actually seems very long-winged. You know, it's got quite long, narrow wings. You know, that's a feature that, you know, is more very difficult to quantify, but that might be more commonly associated with European honey buzzard. So I'm just speculating here on this bird because it does seem to have a very long wing. Can be difficult to tell from a single photo. And then that led, if you then go on to the next slide, Dave, that's led a number of raptor researchers to consider that a number of crested honey buzzards that have been arriving in the Middle East over the last 20 or so years, some are obviously crested honey buzzards and very purely so, but some seem to show features that are mixed. You know, they have features which are clearly crested honey buzzard in one hand, but then also clearly seem to be European honey buzzard on the other hand. And there've been a number of people who've looked into this and taken lots of photos and discussed it and written quite a few articles on it. If anybody is interested in raptor identification and doesn't have the flight identification of raptors of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, by Dick Forsman, I can definitely recommend it. It's absolutely filled with amazing photos and lots of very, very insightful information about how to identify these birds and some of the patterns. Absolutely recommend that you get that book. It's a little bit expensive and difficult to get in South Africa, but if you can source a copy, it's brilliant. And certainly in this book, there've been Dutch birding articles and a number of other articles where the possibility of hybrids has been suggested. And in fact, in this book, Dick shows quite a few birds and speculates that they could in fact be hybrids because they're occurring in the zone of overlap between the birds, and they're also showing characters of both birds. And I guess Jane asked a little bit earlier, well, how you define the zone of overlap in migratory species? That's quite a good question because some migratory species overlap completely, but the zone of overlap would be defined, well, you would need some sort of evidence of overlap on the breeding ground for hybridization. And so you wouldn't, it's where birds are breeding, that's when the zone of overlap would be defined. So where they could be producing these hybrids. And it also would be at the edges of their range. So you might expect hybrids at the very eastern edge of eastern honey buzzard's range and the western edge of crested honey buzzard's range. And if you look at the pattern of these birds that have been thought to be hybrids, that is the pattern they show. So for example, people don't generally claim hybrid honey buzzards from, you know, France or Britain on the very western, sorry, we have to go back, sorry, we don't claim in there, nor do they claim hybrid birds sort of in China on the very eastern, they only claim these hybrid birds in the very middle of the range where the two species join. So the Middle East and Central Asia, that's where all of these funny looking birds that don't seem to match one or the other. The other slightly difficult thing about this is that we have the scenario with the poodles and the Labradors and the Labradoodles, where if a bird is 50-50, one or the other, in theory, it might be easy enough to recognize that there's something a little bit difficult about it and to try and see it's got half the characters of one and half the characters of the other. But if it's then gone on to breed with the other species again, those characters might be diluted. You might have a bird with only a small part of genetic information from one of the birds. And that might be really difficult to identify. So here's a bird, for example, that Dick believes is a hybrid. If you look at it straight up, looks quite a lot like crested honey buzzard. It's got 6 fingers, although maybe 5.5. And it does have the throat patch, but broken up quite a bit. And if you look at the tail, it's quite long, although it is a juvenile bird. But then if you look at it, you can actually see, especially if you look back a little bit, it does have sort of half carpal patches. Can you see that, you know, under the wrist, it's got sort of an orange carpal patch on each wrist. Now that's something that Crested Honey Buzzard would never normally show in the eastern part of its range. And that's thought to be one of the characters that would sort of clinch this as being a hybrid with European honey buzzard. So if we look at the next photo, Dave, again, this bird, of course, looks at a glance more like a European honey buzzard, right? Because look at those giant, big black carpal patches underneath its wrists. But then if you look a bit more carefully, well, it's got 1, 2, 3, it's got 6, 5.5, 6 primaries, which is more Crested Honey Buzzard feature. And, you know, the wings relatively narrow, which is more European honey buzzard feature. The tail's, you know, relatively long, which is more a European honey buzzard feature. But then if you look at the throat, look, it's got a white throat bordered by a black line. That's more of a Crested Honey Buzzard feature. And then it sort of seems to have slightly dark eyes. So that's more of a Crested Honey Buzzard feature, or maybe intermediate eyes. So this is a bird that really has these mixed characteristics, you know, where it's extremely difficult to be sure if it's one or the other. And that it's on these birds that the evidence of hybridization, you know, that's why the authorities in this realm believe that there's a lot of these birds are hybrids. And it seems that depending on your criteria, some people suggest that up to 60% of the birds that move into Eilat and through Israel could be hybrid birds. And that would make sense because, you know, if European honey buzzards are hybridizing with Crested Honey Buzzards in Siberia, and those honey buzzards are then getting the urge to getting the European honey buzzard travel gene, they will then get the urge to go down through to the Middle East and into Africa. So we do have to be a little bit careful when we see birds in Africa to make sure they're not hybrids, because they're more likely to be down here than they are in the Asian part of the range. All right, if we can maybe look at the next photo, please. Having said that, some of these features are very subjective. Often you don't get very good views of the birds, and often the features are subjective, like what does the jizz look like? Is it in between? Isn't it? These are some photographs from Gary Allport took at Masaneta in Mozambique. And if you look immediately, the bird doesn't really look like a European honey buzzard, right? It looks much more like a Crested Honey Buzzard. It's got a broader wing, that sort of more eagle-like look about it. I think it's got 6 primaries if you look there, so it's much more Crested Honey Buzzard-like. But if you lighten up the photo, now you can see in the bottom left, it does seem to have darker carpal patches, which is something that would really count against the pure Crested Honey Buzzard. They shouldn't show any carpal patch there at all. You can see distinctly how on that very pale photo in the bottom left, yeah, you can see there's a carpal patch contrasting with a sort of a more rufusy sand brown arm. So, I mean, but these are slightly subjective. Sometimes when you have a very small bird in the photo and you raise the light levels too much, you know, sometimes you get artifacts that come in. And so, I mean, it's very tempting to say this bird looks a lot like a Crested Honey Buzzard, but then when you see these carpal patches, you probably say, well, maybe it's not. Maybe that's not an artifact of the light. Maybe those are carpal patches, and what we have here is a hybrid. And I think Gary's decided that, you know, it's either a crested or a hybrid, but it's very difficult to say for sure. And maybe the next slide. So I guess that brings us on towards the end, and to sort of take some of these thoughts that we've explored and to apply them to the Somerset West bird, which I'm thinking many of you have gone to see, or at least seen photos of. And so how can we think about what we know and summarize it in the Somerset West bird? Well, we know already that there are these intermediate plumage birds, especially in the Middle East and Central Asia, that could well be hybrids between the species, and that they would tend to migrate towards Africa. So we have to be super cautious. But then we need to look very much on exactly what we can see on this bird, and we have to ask the question, are these characters showing European features, crested features, or a mix? It also helps to age the bird first. If you look at features without knowing whether it's an adult or juvenile, you might get this wrong. And there has been some controversy about the age of this bird, but I think the bird is a juvenile. If you look at the barring on the flight feathers, it's narrow, thin bars, and lots of bars packed together there. There's no big, broad trailing edge that you know, a female would have, or an adult male or female would have. And if you look how neat they are, there's no missing feathers, there's no growing feathers, and it really does seem to be a juvenile. The bird also has a slightly pale eye. In European honey buzzards, it's the adults that show the pale eye, but in crested honey buzzards, it's the adult females and it's the juveniles. And the juvenile eye color changes through its life. So, but juveniles can show pale eyes, and so can adult females. But given that this is seems a juvenile based on its flight feathers, you know, it would indicate that the eye color would support a juvenile. And the other thing you can't quite see on this bird, but you can see if you really zoom into the face, is that it has a yellowish cere. So that further supports the fact that it's a juvenile bird. So we've been lucky in that quite a few world experts have weighed in on what they think our South African bird is. And there's been some differing opinions in the beginning. And I don't think we should be concerned by that, because I think healthy debate's really great in birding. I think if everybody always agreed on what was going on from the very beginning, then you know, there would be something wrong. People do need to get different views and different impressions and have different backgrounds. And I also think all the experts were, of course, identifying the birds from photos, and initially the photos weren't very good. And over time, the photos came out better and gave perhaps a much better impression of the bird. So there was discussion about whether the bird might well be a hybrid. And there were 6 points that were mentioned as being potential hybrid points. So if we look at the bird through those 6 points, we could go through each of them and just assess whether there seem to be hybrid points based on what we've been seeing up until now in this talk. So firstly, something we haven't really talked about is what's called a carpal crescent. And that is, if Dave's pointing it out now, the carpal patch is that big, giant black spot under the wrist that is unmistakable and is often a very distinctive feature of the European honey buzzard. The carpal crescent is sort of the border of it. It's the feathers that lie over the base of the primaries. And it has been thought that this could be an indication of hybrid birds. And there was some evidence in the past that this was the case. But I think the newest research and new looking at photos of birds from the East Asian flyway where there are no hybrids has tended to indicate that it's probably not the most reliable case, and that birds can show dark carpal crescents that are definitely not hybrids. So we could say that the carpal crescent probably doesn't indicate that this bird is a hybrid. Moving on to point 2, there was some suggestion that the wings may be a bit narrow for European honey buzzards, sorry, a bit narrow for crested honey buzzard. And it's true that some of the first photographs, depending on the angle of the bird was seen on the first day when it was photographed well, can create that impression. But now that we've got lots of photographs, and now that, you know, quite a few of us have seen this bird in the field, it's apparent that the bird does seem to have, you know, quite broad wings and has that sort of, you know, eagle-like impression that is created. So I don't think we have any strong indication that there's a hybrid feature there either. Then the gorget, the throat patch, you know, in hybrid birds can be very small. And if we look at the newest photographs that we can see of this bird, we can see clearly that the bird doesn't have a small gorget. It has quite a well-developed gorget, the white throat surrounded by the black streaking. You can see in that bottom right bird very, very clearly that's the case. So that shouldn't indicate a hybrid. If we look at the tail length, crested honey buzzard tends to have a shorter tail than European honey buzzard, distinctly longer than the wings. The tail length is a little bit hard to judge. It's a little bit subjective. It depends on whether you take the base of the wing and the base of the tail feathers, or where they hide in the body. But it's clear that the bird doesn't have an especially long tail. It's definitely on the shorter edge of the tail. Secondary barring is another feature. If you look at the secondary bars in this bird, it's got, I think, 4 secondary bars. And Crested Honey Buzzard juveniles often have 5 or even 6 secondary bars. But then again, if you look at the natural variation in the population, so you don't just look at what's happening in the hybrid zone, but you look at natural variation, it's also true that Crested Honey Buzzards, undefinite juvenile Crested Honey Buzzard, can also show 4 secondary bars. So that doesn't necessarily indicate it's a hybrid at all. And then something else that you can't see very well, you can see a little bit from the second picture here, there on the left. You can see that that bird has got a very heavy base to its bill, bigger than a European honey buzzard. It's not that dainty little beak of the European honey buzzard. It's definitely got a heavier bill base. And that's something that's become more apparent from later photos. In the first pictures, it did look much more slim. And so I think we can say that there's no indication on that basis that the bird is a hybrid. So those are the 6 points that were brought up to indicate the bird was a hybrid. Given the new discussion and new photos, it really seems that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they probably aren't a hybrid, or we can't really be sure. It's true that, of course, as birds hybridize more and more with another pure individual, they become harder and harder to tell if they're hybrids, or if there might be a little bit of hybrid DNA in them. And, you know, how can we really be sure? But I mean, to me anyway, there doesn't seem to be any strong indication of hybrid features in this bird. And I'm looking forward to discussing this further with my colleagues. And certainly in the South African Rarities Committee, we're going to be looking again more closely at the bird and double checking the features and double checking the literature, so we can make a firm decision on, you know, the latest things that are known about this bird, and checking all the photos from all the angles and coming to a firm decision about what we think the likely outcome of this bird is going to be. I mean, great, thank you. I mean, that was mainly what I had to say. And yeah.
Great.
Dave?
Carl, it's Mike here. I'm
Mike,
taking over from Dave as the facilitator of a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I think we're running an enormous risk that we're going to breach our curfew that Cyril's put on us. So we're going to keep the question session quite short. I think you answered, I had a few questions coming through, and I think you answered most. But Roz has asked about the crest, and I have seen some photographs of perch birds where you can see a crest, but I assume it is quite an insignificant feature. Certainly not in flight, it's something you're going to notice.
Yes. It's a little bit, it creates a bit of a shagginess at the back of the head, which you can see on some birds. So on European honey buzzard, it often seems to have quite a small pigeon-like head, whereas in crested, it looks more thick-necked. If you see some of the pictures, like if you look at the picture on the left here, it's got quite a thick neck. You see there. Now that's not formed by the bit of the crest that sticks up, but it's formed by the sort of base of the crest that's sort of shaggy and a little bit reminiscent of African harrier hawk. But it's not a good field feature.
Cool. And then another question, which I thought was a very interesting one. The Crested Honey Buzzard has, as you mentioned right at the beginning, much larger feet.
Yeah.
Is there any suggestion that there is a difference in the prey items of crested versus a European honey buzzard?
I don't know, actually. I haven't researched it enough. I think they're both relatively weak raptors. Okay. So I think it's possible it might be doing something slightly different with different wasps, but I don't think it's going to be eating mammals, for example, except occasionally. I haven't read up on it extensively, but I still think that they still have the adaptations for feeding on stinging insects, you know, the feathers that sort of protect the face. And still, even though the claws are long, they're still relatively weak-footed.
Great, and I think that's pretty much it. I think you've covered it in extreme depth, and I think that's what everyone was looking for. I think a couple of weeks ago, when there was quite a lot of debate around whether it is or isn't a hybrid, and I think we can certainly thank you enormously for those of us that have seen it. because birders love to put that little tick in the book. Yeah, so and I think the very important exercise we've had this evening, particularly with Dave's section on European honey buzzard as well as yours on the crested, is I think people are going to start looking more critically at these honey buzzards when they photograph them. And I think you know, we do in Trevor's reports get to see a lot of honey buzzards, and I think everyone should start looking out for these things. I think these features that you've mentioned are sometimes very subtle, but sometimes they're not, and maybe they'll slip under the radar sometimes. And it's up to us to start trying to find the 5th and 6th and 7th record of crested honey buzzard in Africa. So yeah, I mean, very informative. If I can ask you just to wrap it up, and then we can go enjoy a glass of wine.
Great. I mean, do you want me to say something else?
No, I just said if you could say good night to everybody, and thank you very much for your participation. I owe you a burger.
If I could maybe add something, I see that Kate Morris is on the webinar, so thank you to Kate.
Yes, look at that.
For finding this bird. We're all very grateful.
Cool. And yeah, thanks everyone for, yeah, it's been interesting having to think about this, and for all the questions, and yeah, for the opportunity to chat here. It's been fun.
Fantastic. And then just to close it off, we have recorded the webinar, so if you know anybody that missed it this evening, I know there has been some load shedding. If people that you know have missed it, it'll be on our YouTube channel, Better Birding YouTube channel, in a couple of days. And then obviously it's been broadcast live on Facebook, so it'll be there for posterity as well. So Cal, we thank you enormously. We are going to ask you back to talk to us about, I'm begging you to do a different talk, you know what it is. So hopefully we'll get you back on something different. So thanks so much, really appreciate it.
Cool, great. Thanks,
And
Mike.
good night, everybody. I hope you all learned something. I certainly did.